This is TWiT.
Google is buying Fitbit, and I linked to a story on The Verge that was pretty good about this, which is basically like, well, is it going to be like HTC's phone division, or is it going to be like Nest? Poor Nest. Nest just keeps getting brought up, and Dieter Bohn at The Verge brought it up as
or Motorola. We all forget that.
Motorola,
right.
I guess there's good ways to get swallowed by Google, and there are bad ways.
It seems like mostly bad.
Yeah. So Devendra, let's start with you. How do you feel about this news? I mean, should people who like Fitbits be excited that they've got the backing of Google behind them, this huge company, or should they be worried that it's all going to get ruined?
I feel like Fitbit users have a right to be concerned, just because Google has not proven itself to be the best steward of older platforms. And I think Fitbit was really good at doing like its one thing, right? Fitness tracking, building these really interesting activity sensors. On the smartwatch side of things, we reviewed all their recent ones. They're fine, but they could never be as good as the Apple Watch. So Fitbit needed a push. Certainly Google needed a big push, because I feel like even Google forgot Android Wear exists. So it seems like this is pretty symbiotic, but I have this running theory that Google's just terrible at hardware, and they bring in all these companies to try to help them out, and maybe it'll work out this time. It's just, I wouldn't bet on it.
I think there's a real question about whether they're bringing them in to make a new direction, because the reason Fitbit, you mentioned it, the reason they've done so well in part is because they have stuck to their knitting to a certain degree and said, we're about fitness. We're not going to try to be everything to everybody. And Apple sort of learned that lesson too. Dan, you sat next to me at that Apple event where they announced the Apple Watch, and they sort of were all over the place. And they have refined their message a lot in the last few years. And I wonder, is Apple or is Google buying a refined message here with Fitbit and saying, no, it really is primarily about fitness?
I think that's a big part of it. I mean, obviously, like you said, Apple tried a whole bunch of stuff. They kind of threw everything at the wall and eventually settled on fitness, whereas Fitbit has been doing fitness all along. So like they kind of clearly have their mission mapped out for them there. Google, obviously, they can get a big leg up in this department. I think that's one major advantage here is like Devendra said, like with Android Wear kind of being like a thing they seem to have largely shrugged about. It seems like maybe Fitbit gives them an established brand to hook into that have a lot of very loyal users. And hey, if it doesn't work out, then, it breaks in a year, they can just buy another company, because that's what everybody who ever had a Fitbit broke did. So, I think that it seems like a good combination, but I agree that Google's had sort of a bad history when it comes to acquiring hardware brands. They either seem to sort of peter out, or they just seem like they lose something essential about themselves. And I feel like to me, this feels a little bit like when Yahoo bought Flickr, right? Like everyone was like, Flickr, very specific focus. Like it's great. Yahoo's going to throw some money into this. And at the end of the day, Yahoo really could not figure out what to do with Flickr. And I worry that Google will have the same approach to Fitbit.
Renee, what do you think about this?
I'm going to push back a bit. I think Fitbit was beloved, and people who had them really loved them, but I don't think they were particularly successful. And I think that was part of the reason they sold. It's just really hard to be an independent hardware company. And they ended up going for not even 2 times their valuation, which is not a very good number for them. And we saw that with Eero and Amazon, and we've seen that with a bunch of companies that tried to make it on their own. And I agree with Devendra completely. Google has not really proven themselves with hardware. They have a super successful software operating system with Android, but they've never managed to make it work with tablets, not with smartwatches. They folded their Pixel Slate division. Pixels have tremendous algorithms, but the hardware has always been pretty commodity, and it's never sold particularly well. And my guess is that the thing that people love about Fitbit is Fitbit itself, and just moving that hardware over to Google and having them make some hybrid of Wear OS and Fitbit, which is just going to plug all that data into Google. And I think that's actually what they bought. I think they see the potential for health, and they see just how much health data you can accumulate, and they don't have a successful harvesting tool for that. And I think they're hoping that if they can plug everything about Fitbit into Google's complex, they'll be able to get all that healthcare data, which is also why I don't think they're particularly nervous about people like the offered, you can delete your data from Fitbit if you don't trust us. I think they're looking forward to all the data they can collect going forward.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And Renee, you're absolutely right. I don't think Fitbit would have survived on its own for like another year or two. Like that's a company, it is so tough to be a tiny hardware company, and it's hard to compete with whatever Apple's doing. Like at this point, the Apple Watch can save lives, because of the fall detection and the heart rate monitoring. And like these are things that Fitbit can never really do on its own at this point.
And the silicon is so hard. Like we've seen Qualcomm. Qualcomm has to make money on every chipset they make, and they can do that in phones because there's so many, but there's just no platform for selling watch silicon. So their first chip was a rehashed old phone chip. Second one was that chip rehashed with a coprocessor, and they're trying to do another one. And meanwhile, Apple is sticking systems and packages in our ears, and that's going to be a hard thing to compete with.
There's something in your ear right now, too. Renee,
well, it seems like Google has the cash injection that they might need for that, right? Like, in a perfect world, Google shovels them a bunch of money, and that allows them to sort of build out a lot of the processes they couldn't do as a small hardware company. But at the same time, we all know that in the ideal world, obviously doesn't play out that way a lot of times, because you don't know how to deal with all this money you have, and you have to build these systems from scratch, which is the kind of problem Fitbit's running into. I mean, Apple built its stuff from scratch, but it did so over the process of many, many years of sort of laying all the groundwork. And obviously, that's not something that they can necessarily just flip a switch on.
Personally, I think that Fitbit was such a good steward of Pebble that they deserve whatever they get.
Yeah. I mean, talk about independent hardware companies having a hard time. Pebble was the first one I thought of, and of course, Fitbit ended up buying out Pebble. I think there is a really interesting distinction between being a successful business and gaining traction with an audience. And I feel like the reason that I mentioned Fitbit positively is not necessarily because they weren't burning money and seeking an exit, but because I see a lot of those products being used, and I talk to people who love them, and I think it's interesting because when everybody in the industry started running in the same direction, which is the direction of the Apple Watch, that's where Android Wear went, that's where Samsung took its wearable, its watches and stuff too. Fitbit didn't, and maybe they didn't because they couldn't, but they didn't. They said, look, we're going to be first and foremost a device for activity tracking and fitness, and then we'll add some other features on top of it. And when I talk to people who love Fitbit, that's why they like it, is the simplicity of it. And it does make me wonder, whether that was secret sauce or whether it just was happenstance. Does Google look at that and say, okay, maybe this is the lesson to learn here, is that we were trying to attack this and be all things to all people, and that the success you've got with a product like this is that it's not going to be everything. We're not going to compete with Apple directly. We're going to compete with them kind of at an angle with Fitbit. I don't know.
Well, don't forget the Fitbit. People love that community.
No, yeah, definitely.
Dan and I have a friend who just got an Apple Watch because of some health issues, and he said he's keeping his Fitbit because he can't miss the data on Fitbit.
Wrists. You got two wrists. I don't see what the problem is.
And you can put them on one wrist and be the coolest person in the room with two devices on one wrist.
Your friendship bracelet as well. It's a look.
Don't forget that Fitbit survived this first wave of activity trackers, and there were a ton of companies doing it, right? We forget about Jawbone. Jawbone had a lot of funding. Jawbone also was the pioneer of wireless speakers, and they were kicking butt for so long. I honestly love the Jawbone Up. That was great hardware when it worked. Their software was great, but they kind of flamed out. And now it's really Fitbit and Garmin.
Microsoft Band.
Yeah, and Microsoft Band. A lot of things flamed out. Fitbit was the last independent company left standing, and now maybe Google can have them continue to focus, but I feel like Google has not done much of a health device push on its own too. So I'd expect something more interesting than just another activity tracker from them.
Well, it seems like the big advantage there would potentially be integration, right? Which is what Apple has going for it with the Apple Watch, right? It's so tightly tied into iOS, all your notifications, all the interactions you can do with it. The fact that you can unlock your Mac, you can authorize stuff on your Mac now, that's all a huge advantage. And that plays straight into Apple's strengths, which are these integrations of hardware, software, and services. Google has the services and the software. Like you've said before, the hardware has always been sort of a weak spot for them. So is this an opportunity for them to build something that does compete at that level, that can offer the same kind of integration that the Apple Watch offers for iOS users, but instead for Android users? In theory, seems like that's what Android Wear should have been, but it doesn't seem like it panned out that way.
Yeah, Dan, I like.
Sorry.
No, I was just going to approve Dan's joke earlier and say maybe Google just had Android Wear clipped to their belt and they thought it was there, and then they looked and it was gone, and they're like, I guess we got to buy another Fitbit.